In a freezing Montana auction hall, a scarred military K9 lies on the concrete like he's already been erased. Then a 2-year-old retired SWAT officer stands up, pays the price, and gives the dog a new name, Rex. But the first night at the cabin, thunder hits, and Rex runs like he's fleeing a battlefield. Days later, a veterinarian finds something buried under his neck scars, a tiny tracker, still active. And if someone is tracking Rex, it means someone never stopped hunting him. Subscribe now, because what shows up on that snowy road next changes everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We are very curious to see how far our story will reach. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Snow worked the Montana night like a slow, patient eraser, whitening the roads outside Bozeman until every tire track looked temporary and every decision felt permanent. Inside the county auction house, the light was the wrong kind of bright, fluorescent, buzzing, and cruel, as if it had been hired to testify against everyone's face. The building smelled of wet wool, diesel tracked in on boots, and that faint metallic tang old heaters give off when they're fighting a losing war. People packed the folding chairs in the same way they pack their opinions, tight, loud, and certain. They came for discount saddles, repossessed tools, a half-broken snowmobile, the strange comfort of watching someone else's misfortune become inventory. They came to bargain with winter, as if cold could be outbid. Near the center of the concrete floor, on a frayed mat that might once have been a welcome, a German shepherd lay motionless, ribs faint under a dull coat the color of burnt wheat. The dog's muzzle had begun to silver, not with dignity but with time's stubborn insistence. One ear bore a notch like a missing word. Scars, some clean and pale, some dark and puckered, stitched a map across his shoulders and neck, cartography drawn by hands that had mistaken pain for discipline. His paws were thick. The pads cracked as if they'd walked too many miles on roads that didn't forgive. Yet the strangest thing was not the damage, it was the restraint. He did not cower. He did not plead. His eyes, amber gone dim, like a lantern behind frosted glass, stared at nothing in particular, the way veterans stare when the room is safe, but their minds are not. In the paperwork clipped to the auctioneer's stand, the dog was listed as impounded property guard dog, unpredictable, a bureaucrat's little spell, neat and heartless, designed to make a living creature sound like a liability instead of a life. If anyone had cared to read between the lines, they might have heard the deeper message. This one has been filed away to disappear. Frank Miller stood in the back row, where shadows pooled beneath the exit sign. 62 years sat on him the way winter sat on the mountains, heavy, practiced, and unromantic. He was tall enough to look over most heads, broad in the shoulders even after time had sanded him down, though his posture carried the subtle forward tilt of a man whose body had learned to brace before it had learned to rest. His hair, once dark, had gone iron gray and was clipped short, as if he still expected someone to call him to attention. A trimmed mustache and stubble framed a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, the angles softened only by the fatigue around his eyes. He wore a battered canvas jacket with a stitched patch that no longer meant anything official SWAT, because retirement makes every title sound like a ghost story. The jacket hung a little loose now. Grief and age had stolen some weight. His hands were the hands of a man who had opened doors with guns drawn, who had once trusted his own reflexes more than his own heart. The knuckles were slightly swollen, the fingers scarred, and on his left wrist a pale line hinted at a surgery he never spoke about. Frank's face could still put fear into a room if he wanted it to. Tonight he didn't want it to. Tonight he wanted to be invisible. He had not planned to come. His cabin sat miles out, tucked between pine and stubborn rock, a place he'd inherited and then turned into a fortress of routine. Coffee at dawn, perimeter checks out of habit. A radio that stayed off because human voices had begun to feel like sandpaper. He told himself he liked the solitude. He told himself a lot of things. 3 years ago, the last call-out hostage situation, Small house, too many variables, had ended with a split-second choice that saved one life and cost another. The department called it within protocol. Frank's conscience called it something else. He retired not because he was ordered to, but because the noise inside him had become louder than the sirens outside. Since then, he'd lived like a man trying to atone by shrinking, as if making himself smaller could make the past smaller too. And then he'd seen the listing in the classifieds, 6 bland words with sharp edges. Former service dog, aggressive final sale. It was the phrase, former service, that hooked him. Like an old hymn, remembered by a mouth that had forgotten how to sing. Service meant something to Frank. It meant you did the hard thing because it was the hard thing. It meant loyalty wasn't a slogan, it was an ache. The listing made his coffee taste like pennies. So here he was, standing among strangers, pretending he was only curious. A man in a red beanie, cheeks flushed from beer and cold air, leaned toward his buddy and said, not quite under his breath, "That thing's busted!" His friend laughed, the sound bouncing off concrete like dropped coins. "Damaged goods," someone else added, pleased with the cleverness of cruelty. The auctioneer, a woman named Linda Carver, cleared her throat into a microphone that made her voice louder, but not kinder. Linda was in her late 50s, with a blunt bob of dyed blonde hair that looked as stiff as her patience. Her face carried the permanent tightness of someone who had spent decades herding chaos into line items. She wore a sequined scarf that tried very hard to look festive and failed in the way desperate optimism often fails. "All right, folks," she announced, tapping the paperwork with a pen. Impounded dog. Liability waiver required. Starting bid $50. "Anyone?" she said. Liability, the way priests say, sin. No hands rose. A pause blossomed, awkward and familiar. In that silence, the shepherd's chest rose and fell, steady, as if he had decided breathing was the only commitment he could afford. Frank felt the old reflex in his bones. Assess the room, find the exits, calculate threat. But the only threat here was indifference, and it moved like fog, soft, everywhere, suffocating. He studied the dog again. Not the scars, not the ribs, the eyes. Frank recognized that emptiness because he had worn it himself in bathrooms at 3 a.m., staring at his own reflection as if it were a suspect. It was the look of a being who had been asked to endure more than a body should, and then punished for the parts that refused to break cleanly. Linda tried again, a hint of annoyance creeping in. $50. Come on. He's housebroken, probably. She delivered probably, with the confidence of someone selling a mystery box. More laughter rippled, nervous and unkind. Frank did not feel heroic. If anything, he felt tired. Tired in the marrow. Tired in that ancient place where a person stores every time they didn't do enough. His mind offered him sensible arguments, like a lawyer paid by fear. You don't need this. You live alone. You're 62. Your knee barely tolerates stairs. What are you going to do with a traumatized shepherd? The dog could bite you. The dog could die on your floor. The dog could make you care again, and caring is expensive. Then another voice, older and meaner, rose up from the basement of his memory. And what are you going to do if you walk away? Frank's hand lifted almost without permission. The gesture felt strange, like raising a flag after years of surrender. "I'll take him," he said. His voice came out steady, carrying the command tone he thought he'd buried. It cut through the murmurs, the way a blade cuts rope. The room quieted, heads turned. Someone muttered, "Old guy's got a death wish." Another snorted, "Good luck with Cujo." Linda blinked, surprised into professionalism. "Bidder in the back 50. Do I hear 60? No one answered. The silence returned, heavier now, embarrassed by its own cruelty. Linda shrugged. "Sold. $50. She brought the gavel down with a sound like a verdict. On the mat, the shepherd did not move, but Frank saw the smallest shift muscle tightening beneath the skin, ears flattening by degrees. The dog had heard the word sold, and whatever history rode behind that word had just climbed onto his spine. Frank walked forward slowly, boots squeaking on the concrete, hands open at his sides. He stopped several feet away, respecting the invisible border that trauma draws. Up close, the shepherd smelled of old fur and disinfectant, and something else fear, yes, but also a stubborn spark, like a match refusing to go out. The dog's collar was cheap nylon, too bright for him, as if someone had tried to dress a tragedy in a cheerful costume. A chain leash lay nearby, the links rusted. Frank crouched not too low, not too fast. He kept his eyes soft, not challenging, not pitying. "Hey," he said, quietly, the way he used to speak to rookies, shaking after their first shooting. "I'm not here to hurt you." He paused, then added, with a dry edge of humor, even he didn't know he still possessed. The paperwork already did enough of that. The shepherd's eyes flicked toward him. For a fraction of a second, something alive sharpened their attention. Calculation, the faint outline of a soldier's discipline under all the ruin. Then the dog surged. It happened with terrifying speed. A lunge, jaws opening, the air suddenly too small. People gasped. A chair scraped. Someone shouted, "I told you!" Frank did not move. Not because he was fearless. Fear was in him, hot and immediate, but because he understood the language. Sudden movement would turn panic into attack. He held still as stone, as if he were one of the old gods in a mountain tale, testing whether a mortal would flinch before the truth. The shepherd stopped short, inches from Frank's throat, teeth bared but not closing. Hot breath hit Frank's skin, carrying the smell of hunger and past violence. Their eyes locked. In that suspended moment, Frank felt an impossible thing. Recognition, traveling both directions. The dog's body trembled, not with rage but with conflict, as if two commands fought inside him. One command said, "Destroy the threat before it destroys you." The other, smaller command, older, nobler, said, "Wait. Assess. Don't waste your teeth on the wrong war." Frank swallowed, carefully, and spoke into the space between them. "You don't have to prove anything here," he murmured. "Not to them. Not to me." His voice softened further. "You've already survived." The shepherd's lips quivered. The teeth disappeared behind them, like knives being sheathed. He backed away a step, then another, confusion replacing fury. The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for years. Linda cleared her throat again, eager to return the evening to commerce. "Sir, you'll need to sign the waiver," she said, sliding a clipboard toward Frank. "And, you'll take him out the side door." Frank took the pen. The waiver was long and ridiculous, full of legal poetry that had never once saved anyone from consequences. He signed anyway. He was good at signing things that hurt. Beside him, the shepherd watched, head low, eyes tracking Frank's hands, as if hands had been the beginning of every nightmare. Frank finished, handed the clipboard back, and turned to the dog. "All right," he said, keeping his tone light. "We're gonna need a name." He glanced at the cheap tag on the collar blank, like the dog's history had been erased on purpose. The crowd had called him junk, damaged, it. None of those were names. Those were excuses. Frank's gaze returned to the shepherd's eyes, and something in Frank's chest cracked a small, clean fracture that let in air. "Rex," he said, short, common, solid, a name that didn't apologize for existing. A king's name, if one believed old Latin myths. The shepherd Rex did not wag. He did not lean in. But his ears twitched, and for a heartbeat his posture shifted, as if the syllable had brushed against a forgotten identity. Frank rose, took the worn leather leash the staff offered, and laid it on the ground rather than snapping it on like a chain. "Your choice," Frank said. "We can stand here all night. I've done worse shifts." The smallest hint of humor flickered again, and to his surprise, it steadied him. Minutes passed. The auction house moved on to the next item, the crowd's attention scattering like startled birds. Rex stared at the leash, then at Frank. Frank stayed still, breathing slow, letting the dog measure him. Outside, wind pressed its cold face against the building, impatient. Finally, Rex rose. His legs were stiff, but they held. He stepped forward, not eagerly, not trustingly, but deliberately, as if choosing movement over surrender. Frank did not reach for him. He simply walked toward the side door and let Rex follow at his own distance, a shadow that refused to be dragged. When the door opened, winter poured in sharp, clean, and honest. Snowflakes spun under the floodlight like tiny white moths. Frank led the way across the lot to his old pickup, the kind of truck that didn't care about appearances as long as it started. He opened the passenger door, then stepped back. Rex hesitated, nostrils flaring, ears pivoting. The world outside the auction house suddenly too wide. Frank waited, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. "No rush," he said. "The world's been rushing you long enough." Rex gathered himself and climbed in, claws clicking softly on metal. Frank closed the door with a careful gentleness that felt almost like prayer, then walked around to the driver's side. As he slid behind the wheel, he realized his hands were shaking, not from cold, not entirely. The last time he'd felt this kind of tremor, he'd been kneeling beside a teammate, begging the universe to rewind. Tonight, he wasn't begging. Tonight, he was choosing. The truck engine turned over with a reluctant cough, then caught. Frank pulled out into the snowy night. In the passenger seat, Rex sat rigid, eyes forward, as if expecting betrayal at every mile marker. Frank kept both hands on the wheel and spoke to the windshield, to the road, to the unseen gods of second chances. "All right, Rex," he said quietly. "Let's go home." And somewhere under the dog's scars, something listened small, wary, but not dead. The cabin sat at the edge of the pines like a thought no one finished, its roof hunched under fresh snow while the wind worried the eaves with long fingernails of ice. Frank's truck crunched up the drive and stopped with a sigh that sounded almost relieved to be home. But Rex did not share the sentiment. The German Shepherd stayed rigid in the passenger seat, head high, eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the cabin door, as if it were an ambush site wearing wooden skin. The dog was large, even in his ruined state, a thick-boned shepherd with a broad chest and a neck that still held the memory of strength, though the scars there made the fur grow in uneven patches like grass after a fire. His muzzle was dusted gray, his coat dulled by neglect, and his gaze held that veteran's stare, alert, without hope, ready without trust. Frank opened his own door, stepped down into snow that squeaked under his boots, and waited in the cold long enough for the world to prove it wasn't going to collapse just because he moved first. "All right, Rex," he said quietly, not looking directly at the dog's eyes the way he'd once been trained not to lock gaze with frightened men holding guns. "This is the part where we pretend we're normal." He tried, a thin slice of humor, and it hung in the air like breath, brief, fragile, vanishing. Rex did not move. The dog's ears flicked, measuring tone more than words, measuring whether the human voice carried hooks. Frank didn't reach in to pull him out, didn't clap, didn't coax like a well-meaning fool. He walked away from the truck toward the porch, slow and deliberate, hands visible, giving Rex room to decide whether this new world was another cage or something else. Behind him, Rex finally hopped down, landing stiffly, claws scraping the packed snow, then stopped again, refusing to cross the invisible line between open air and enclosed shelter. The porch light cast a weak cone onto the steps, turning the snow to pale gold, and Frank saw the dog's chest hitch, as if the idea of a door closing behind him made his lungs remember something awful. Frank's cabin was small but solid, built by his grandfather with timber and stubbornness, the kind of place meant to outlast weather and grief. Inside, a wood stove waited. Inside, warmth was possible. Outside, Rex stood like a statue made of muscle and distrust. Frank could have forced the issue: leash, command voice, brute insistence. He had forced men to comply before. He had learned what it cost. Tonight he chose a different kind of strength. He went back inside the truck, pulled out an old wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and engine oil, and laid it on the porch boards. He set a metal bowl of water on the step, then another bowl of food, something simple, not fancy, because hunger should not come with conditions. He sat down, with his back against the cabin wall, knees stretched out, and let the cold seep into him like a reminder. Rex watched from the yard, tail low but not tucked, head angled to track every twitch of Frank's hands. The distance between them was about 20 feet, but it might as well have been 20 years of betrayal. Frank stared out at the trees instead of staring at the dog, because sometimes the safest way to be seen is not to demand attention. Hours passed. The wind softened, then sharpened again. The sky stayed the color of bruised steel. Frank's bad knee throbbed, the same knee that had gone wrong on a stairwell years ago during a raid, when he'd hit the landing hard and kept moving anyway because someone was screaming behind a locked door. Pain had always been a tool he could ignore. Loneliness was the one that got under his armor. He found himself listening to Rex's breathing across the yard, steady, controlled, like the dog was counting each inhale to make sure it didn't become a mistake. In the middle of the night, Rex finally approached the porch by inches, not stepping onto it, but sniffing the air, reading the blanket, the bowls, the human sitting like a silent sentry. He did not eat. He did not drink. But he came close enough for Frank to see the tremor in his forelegs, the minute shiver of a body trying not to show weakness. Frank kept his gaze on the trees and said softly, "You don't owe me trust. Not yet. Maybe not ever." His breath floated out and vanished. Rex backed away and resumed his post near the fence line, eyes on the cabin door as if guarding it from something that lived inside. Morning arrived reluctantly, gray and thin. Frank rose with stiffness in his hips, rolled his shoulders, and opened the cabin door just enough to let warmth escape like a promise. Rex flinched at the creak. Frank shut it again gently, then walked to the truck and made a phone call he hadn't made in a long time. The number belonged to a veterinarian in town, someone his neighbor once recommended when a horse threw a shoe. When the call connected, a calm voice answered, and Frank realized how long it had been since he'd spoken to a stranger without scanning for threat. "This is Dr. Emily Carter," the voice said. "If this is an emergency, tell me what you're seeing." Emily arrived an hour later in a mud-splattered pickup with a topper and a magnetic clinic logo on the door. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, moving with the efficient grace of someone used to animals that outweighed her and men who underestimated her. Her hair was dark brown and pulled into a low bun that looked like it had been tied that way in the parking lot, and her skin held the pale winter tone of someone who spent her days under fluorescent clinic lights and her nights under barn lamps. Her face was thoughtful rather than pretty sharp cheekbones, steady hazel eyes, and a mouth that had learned to be gentle without being soft. She wore a heavy parka, worn leather gloves, and boots caked with dried mud, and she carried herself like a person who had seen enough suffering to stop being shocked by it. When she stepped out, she did not walk straight toward Rex. She paused, looked at Frank, looked at the dog, and nodded once, as if acknowledging an invisible set of rules. "He won't let you close," she said, her tone factual, not judgmental. "And the door's a trigger." Frank's brow lifted. "You've seen this before?" Emily's mouth tightened briefly, the kind of expression that belonged to a memory. "Not with dogs from auctions," she said. "But with working animals that were handled wrong. And with people, too." She didn't elaborate, but Frank caught the weight behind it. Something had shaped her patience into steel. Emily set her medical bag down by the truck instead of carrying it toward Rex. Metal zippers, sharp smells, instruments, those could be lightning to a traumatized mind. She approached only as far as the porch steps, crouched, and spoke in a low, even tone meant to flow under fear instead of crashing into it. Rex's hackles rose anyway. A growl rolled from his chest, not loud but deep, a warning from the basement of his body. Emily didn't move closer. She watched Rex's posture the way a musician watches a conductor. "That's not aggression," she murmured to Frank. "That's panic wearing teeth." Frank felt something cold settle in him. He'd seen panic in men's eyes right before they did something irreversible. Rex wasn't trying to dominate. He was trying to survive. Emily asked Frank for details: how the dog moved, whether he ate, whether he drank, Any limping? Any coughing? Frank answered with the clipped precision of a man used to reports. He noticed Rex listened, ears swiveling, as if the dog understood he was being discussed like a case file again. Frank's voice softened without his permission. He hasn't touched the food, he admitted. But he came close last night. Emily nodded. Close is a win, she said. Close is a crack in the wall. She offered Frank a small bottle of high-calorie paste and instructions to leave it in a spot Rex could reach without feeling trapped. We're not going to corner him, she said, meeting Frank's eyes. Cornered animals don't learn. They just react. The words landed in Frank like a mirror. He'd cornered himself for years and called it control. All day, Frank kept things quiet. No radio, no clanging pans, no sudden movement. He moved around Rex the way you move around a skittish horse, predictable, calm, respectful. He talked occasionally, not to command, but to exist, telling Rex about mundane things, as if the ordinary might become a bridge. The woodpile, the stove that smoked if you didn't open the damper right, the way the wind liked to sneak through the pines and make the branches sound like whispering. Rex paced, stopped, watched, lay down, then rose again, a restless orbit that never settled. The bowls remained nearly untouched. When Frank tried to inch closer, Rex's body tightened like a spring. Frank stopped every time. He refused to make progress by force. In the late afternoon, Emily called to check in. Frank found himself surprised by how much he wanted to hear a voice that wasn't his own. Any change? She asked. He's still outside, Frank said. Still watching the door, like it owes him money. Emily gave a quiet laugh, brief but warm. He might, she replied. Some doors have a lot to answer for. Then the weather turned. It started as a low moan in the trees, then a pressure in the air. Clouds thickened. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of drop that feels personal. Frank smelled it before it hit ozone and cold metal. He'd seen storms roll in over deserts and over cities, but Montana storms arrived like something ancient and offended. By evening, the first thunder crack split the sky. The sound was enormous, not just loud but intimate, vibrating in the bones. Rex's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The dog bolted, slamming into the fence, then pivoted and ran toward the tree line with the blind urgency of a creature fleeing an invisible battlefield. Frank shouted his name once, Rex, and the dog did not even flick an ear. Frank grabbed his flashlight and his jacket, his knee already protesting, and ran after him into snow that had begun to fall harder. The storm swallowed sound and replaced it with its own language, wind, thunder, the slap of ice against branches. Frank tracked Rex by the faint indentations in the snow and the occasional glimpse of a dark shape moving between trunks. He didn't chase fast. He chased smart, keeping Rex in sight without pressing too close. After a few hundred yards, the ground dipped. A drainage ditch, half filled with drifted snow, cut across the land like a hidden mouth. Rex slid down into it and scrambled, claws skittering, unable to climb the icy sides. He spun in circles, panting hard, eyes wild with the kind of fear that doesn't recognize a friend. Frank stopped at the edge, heart pounding, rain and sleet hitting his face. He could have jumped down. He could have grabbed. But he knew what that would look like to Rex. Hands reaching, body looming, trap closing. So Frank did the thing that felt hardest and most unnatural to a man trained to act. He sat down in the snow at the edge of the ditch, jacket soaking through, and made himself small. Thunder rolled again, and Frank let it roll through him without flinching, as if demonstrating a new kind of courage. I know, he said, voice low enough to be carried by breath rather than authority. I know what it sounds like when the sky turns into a weapon. Rex froze, chest heaving, ears pinned. Frank kept talking, not pushing closer. I've heard storms that sounded like mortars, he continued, and I've been stupid enough to think I could outrun it. He swallowed hard. The confession tasted like rust. You can't outrun it, Rex. You just wait it out. You find one thing that's real, one breath at a time. Minutes stretched. The storm raged. Frank's hands went numb. His knee screamed, and he ignored it, because pain was familiar and guilt was not. Rex paced in the ditch, then stopped, staring up at Frank. The dog's body was still coiled, still ready to explode, but the frantic edge dulled by a fraction. Frank lifted his hands slightly, palms open, a universal sign in any species. "I'm not coming to take you. You can stay there," Frank said softly. "I'm not moving. I've got nowhere else I'd rather be right now." He meant it more than he expected. The thunder drifted farther away. Snow fell in thicker, quieter sheets. Rex took one step, then another, not toward Frank but toward the spot beneath him where the ditch wall was least steep. He tried to climb, slipped, tried again. Frank didn't cheer. He didn't rush. He simply shifted his body a little to give Rex a wider view of the path out. Rex gathered himself and scrambled up, claws digging, shoulders shaking. When he reached the top, he stood 3 feet from Frank, trembling, eyes locked on him as if asking a question he didn't have words for. Frank didn't touch him. He just breathed. Rex breathed back. For a moment, in the snow and the storm's fading growl, they existed in the same world without violence. Not trust. Trust was a bridge still under construction, but a ceasefire, a treaty made of breath. Frank rose slowly, careful with his knee, and turned toward the cabin. Rex followed, not at his side, not behind, but close enough to share the same direction. Back at the porch, Rex paused again at the threshold, the door still a dark promise. Frank didn't insist. He shook snow from his jacket, set the flashlight down, and sat on the porch boards like he had the night before. Rex lay in the yard this time, closer than before, head on his paws, eyes open. Frank stared out into the storm's leftovers and felt an unfamiliar ache under his ribs. Something like relief, something like grief. He thought of all the nights he'd sat alone with his memories, refusing help because he believed pain was a punishment he deserved. Tonight, he had sat with a dog in a ditch and offered him something he had never offered himself: permission to stop running. The bowls of food and water sat untouched, but Rex was still here, and Frank knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime reading danger, that the first real victory was not the dog coming to him. It was the dog not leaving. The days after the storm arrived with a strange, careful quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful so much as watchful, as if winter itself had pulled a chair up close to listen. Snow kept falling in polite layers, and the pines behind Frank's cabin held it like old men holding grudges, silently, heavily, without complaint. Frank established a routine not because he believed in miracles, but because routine was the closest thing he had to faith. Coffee at first light, firewood stacked before noon, boots on and off without slamming doors, and a steady voice used like a lantern in a long hallway. He spoke to Rex the way he'd once spoken to men in the aftermath of violence. Simple facts, no sudden demands, room for dignity. "I'm going to the woodpile," he'd say. "I'm coming back." It sounded ridiculous at first, announcing himself to a dog who barely looked at him. But Frank had learned the nervous system was not impressed by logic. It wanted predictability. It wanted proof. Rex still refused the threshold. The porch remained his border treaty, and the yard his kingdom of caution. Yet he shifted closer by inches each day, like an old wolf testing whether the trap had finally been removed. He started drinking at night, when Frank pretended not to watch. He took the high-calorie paste Emily suggested, licking it from a plate placed just beyond the porch light's edge. When Frank sat on the steps, Rex would sometimes lie down in the snow within 20 feet, head on his paws, ears awake, eyes half shut, but never fully asleep. Frank recognized that half sleep, it was the kind he'd lived on for years, rest without surrender. On the 4th morning after the storm, Dr. Emily Carter returned with a plan that looked less like medicine and more like diplomacy. She arrived before noon, bundled in a charcoal parka with a hood rimmed in frost, her dark hair tucked under a knit cap, her cheeks pinked by cold. She carried no jangling instruments this time, only a folded blanket and a small pouch that smelled unmistakably of real meat. She moved like someone who knew that healing was mostly timing and humility. "We're going to earn one touch today," she told Frank, her voice calm but edged with focus. "Not a full exam, just one touch that doesn't end in fear." Frank's jaw tightened as if he'd been given an assignment with a deadline. Emily's eyes softened. "Not for him," she added. "For you. You're the one who keeps wanting to rush the ending." Frank exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "I'm 62, he said. "Everything feels like it's on a deadline." They worked slowly. Emily sat on the porch steps at a diagonal, not facing Rex head-on, and rolled a small piece of meat between her gloved fingers. Frank stayed a few feet away, slightly behind her, letting Rex decide who the threat was. Rex watched, body low, weight back, his scars stark against his coat when the light hit them. His ear notch gave his silhouette a permanent look of having been argued with by life. Emily placed the meat on the porch boards, then backed her hand away. Rex approached with the cautious precision of a bomb technician. He ate, then retreated, then returned again. Each time he returned, his steps looked less like a flight plan and more like a choice. When Rex finally paused close enough for Emily to extend her hand, she didn't touch his head, never the head first with animals carrying trauma. She aimed for the shoulder, where dogs can accept contact without feeling trapped. Her fingertips barely grazed fur. Rex flinched hard, a full-body shudder, then froze. The old reflex rose in him like a wave. Frank felt his own muscles brace, ready for teeth, ready for disaster. But Emily kept her hand still and light, and removed it immediately, as if to say, "I can leave you alone whenever you need." Rex's breathing slowed by one fraction. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even calm. But it was not panic, and that was the first real crack in the wall. "Good," Emily murmured, more to Rex than to Frank. "That was good." Frank felt heat behind his eyes and hated himself for it. He turned his head toward the trees, so no one could accuse him of hope. Emily's next goal was practical. She needed to check Rex's neck, specifically the ridge of scar tissue Frank had noticed when Rex stretched the night before. Frank had seen the shape under the fur, something not natural, a subtle raised line that didn't match bone. "Could be an old chip," Emily said quietly. "Could be shrapnel. Could be something else." The way she said, "something else," made Frank's mouth go dry. They repeated the same ritual: meat, distance, breath. Rex allowed Emily to get close enough to run 2 fingers along the scar line. The moment her glove brushed that area, Rex stiffened so fast it looked like a switch had been thrown. His lips curled, not in a snarl of dominance, but in the pure horror of memory. Emily stopped at once, hands lowering, body turning slightly away to reduce pressure. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'm done." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes narrowed in thought. "That reaction," she said to Frank later, once Rex had backed away and resumed his patrol stance, "is not about pain. That's about association. Someone did something to him there." Frank stared at the cabin door, suddenly seeing the whole world as a hallway with traps. "What kind of something?" he asked. Emily's mouth tightened again. "The kind I don't like to name." That night, while Rex paced the perimeter of the porch light like a sentry, Emily called a colleague of hers, an older veterinary tech, who worked part-time at the county shelter and had a hobby of identifying microchips from animals that came through with mysterious histories. The woman's name was Tessa Lowell, a compact, sharp-eyed person in her late 50s, with silver hair, cut close, and hands that moved like they were always sorting evidence. She didn't come in person, no need to add another stranger to Rex's fragile circle, but she gave Emily a list of serial formats and what they tended to mean. "If it's a tracker," Tessa warned through the phone, "it won't look like a pet chip. It'll be smaller, tougher, and someone will have paid good money to hide it." Emily listened, expression growing more severe. Frank watched her face and felt the old SWAT instinct awaken the part of him that could smell a larger crime through a single small clue. The next morning, Emily returned with sedation supplies, not the heavy kind, not the knock him out and get it done arrogance that Rex's body clearly remembered. but a carefully measured dose designed to reduce panic without stealing dignity. She explained it to Frank first, slowly, as if he were the one who might bolt. "I won't do this if he can't tolerate it," she said. "And I won't do it unless you're here and he can see you." Frank nodded. His throat felt tight. He understood what it meant to consent to vulnerability. They set the scene like a peace negotiation. The porch boards were cleared. The medical bag remained closed until the last moment. Frank sat on the lowest step, knees apart, hands resting on his thighs, posture relaxed but steady. He spoke softly to Rex, telling him about meaningless things, the way the coffee pot always gurgled like it was complaining, the way the wind had switched directions, the way the snow made the world look clean even when nothing inside you was. Rex watched him with that frost glass gaze. When Emily finally approached with the syringe, she moved as if she were walking through sacred ground. Her gloved hand was steady. Her eyes never left Rex's body language. Rex didn't lunge. He didn't flee. He trembled, but he stayed. Frank's chest tightened with a strange pride he didn't quite trust. The sedative took effect gradually. Rex's muscles loosened by degrees. His eyelids drooped, then lifted again, fighting sleep like it was another trap. Frank leaned forward slightly. "You're okay," he murmured. "I'm right here." With Rex calm enough to allow contact, Emily parted the fur along the scar line on his neck. Under the thickened skin, her fingers found something hard and foreign. She used a small, sterile tool, the kind that doesn't gleam threateningly, and worked slowly, speaking out loud in a soothing rhythm. "Just a little pressure. You're doing great. Good boy." Frank hated the phrase "good boy" because it sounded childish, but on Emily's lips, it sounded like respect, like a medal pinned quietly in private. The object emerged. A tiny capsule, no longer than a fingernail, matte black, with a faint serial number etched along one side. It wasn't a pet microchip. It was too rugged, too purpose-built. Emily held it up between tweezers, her expression hardening into anger so controlled it looked cold. "Tracker," she said simply. Frank felt his stomach drop, as if a floor had vanished beneath him. He'd spent years teaching himself that the war was over, that the threats were memories now, not men. The little capsule on Emily's tweezers told him the opposite. Someone had marked this dog. Someone had expected to find him. Emily photographed the serial number and sent it to Tessa, who ran it against a few private registries she had access to through rescue networks and retired working dog groups. 2 hours later, Emily's phone buzzed. She read the message, and her face went pale in a way the winter couldn't explain. "I have a partial match," she said, voice tight. "It's linked to a contractor training program. The name that keeps coming up." She hesitated, as if speaking it might summon it. "Captain Wade Harrington." Frank stared at Rex, still groggy, breathing slow, ears twitching at sounds even in sedation. The name Harrington rang through Frank's memory like a distant siren. He'd heard it years ago, in law enforcement circles. A former military canine program consultant who left official service under a cloud, then resurfaced in private security with a reputation for producing obedient dogs at any cost. Rumors said his methods worked. Other rumors said the dogs didn't survive long afterward. Rumors, Frank had learned, were often the shadow cast by a truth nobody wanted to stand under. That afternoon, a visitor arrived, uninvited, crunching up the drive in an old pickup that sounded like it had seen too many winters to be impressed by another. Ray Jenkins stepped out. He was Frank's age but looked older in the ways that mattered, face wind-burned, eyes permanently narrowed against both sun and disappointment. Ray was stocky, shoulders squared as if he still wore a duty belt, with a thick gray beard that made his mouth look like it was always half grumbling. His hair was thinning under a faded ball cap, and his hands, big, rough, stained with oil, belonged to a man who fixed his own problems because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. Ray had been a patrol sergeant before retirement, a man who'd learned cynicism the hard way after a partner got killed by a suspect who should have been in custody. It changed Ray's personality from friendly to blunt, from hopeful to vigilant. He hugged nobody. He spoke like every word was a tool. "You bought yourself a dog," Ray said by way of greeting, eyes scanning the property with the habit of a cop who never stopped looking for exits. Frank nodded once. "Yeah." Ray's gaze landed on Rex, who was awake now but keeping distance, head angled to watch Ray with a stillness that looked almost military. Ray whistled low. "That's not a backyard shepherd," he muttered. "That's a dog that's seen things." Frank didn't argue. Ray shifted his weight, beard bristling. "I'm here because people are talking," he said. "Couple of strangers came through town yesterday. Not locals. Clean truck. Out-of-state plates. The kind that don't buy gas inside. Just stare. They asked about a shepherd from the auction. They didn't say dog. They said shepherd. Like a category. Like inventory." Frank's blood cooled. Emily's hand tightened around her phone. Ray kept going, voice lower now. "They were polite, in the way polite men are when they've practiced it. One of them had a scar that cut through his eyebrow, made him look like he was always surprised. The other had no eyebrows at all, shaved off or burned off. I couldn't tell. They didn't smile. They just asked questions, like they already knew the answers." He looked at Frank, eyes hard. "Whatever you bought, Frank, it wasn't just a dog." Rex, as if understanding the danger in the air, moved to the yard's edge and stared down the drive, ears forward, body still. The sentinel had woken fully. Frank felt the old SWAT part of himself stand up inside his ribs, an internal soldier grabbing his helmet. He hated the feeling. He also knew it. He looked at the tracker capsule sealed in a small evidence bag on Emily's porch table and understood the ugly joke the universe was telling. He'd bought a second chance, and it came with a tail. Frank crouched slightly, not toward Rex but near him, speaking in that steady tone he'd used in the ditch. "Hey," he murmured, "you're not a target anymore." His words were half promise, half prayer. Rex didn't look at him. Rex looked at the road. The dog's posture said what Frank's heart didn't want to admit yet. Someone out there still believed Rex belonged to them. As dusk approached, the sky turned purple-gray, and the wind began to push again, as if winter was leaning closer to hear the next decision. Frank stood on the porch beside Emily and Ray. He felt the ache of his knee, the ache of his past, the ache of a life he'd tried to shrink into silence. Rex paced once, then stopped, choosing a spot with a clear view of the driveway and the tree line. Guarding not out of fear now, but out of duty, Frank watched him and felt something dangerous and bright ignite in his chest. Anger, yes, but also purpose, the kind he thought he'd lost. "They came looking," Frank said quietly. Ray's mouth twisted. "Then they'll come again." Emily's hazel eyes narrowed like a blade finding its edge. "And next time," she said, voice calm but fierce, "we'll be ready." Frank nodded once, the way a man nods before stepping back into a fight he didn't ask for but can't walk away from. Rex's ears flicked, catching the cadence of that resolve, and for the briefest moment, Frank imagined the dog understood not just the words, but the vow behind them. The night settled in, cold and watching, and three silhouettes, an old SWAT officer, a determined veterinarian, and a scarred shepherd held the porch as if it were the last honest place left in the world. Night arrived early and mean, the kind of Montana winter night that doesn't just darken the land but narrows it, funneling every sound into sharp corners. The cabin's windows held back the cold like clenched teeth, and the pines beyond the porch stood black and patient, their branches heavy with snow that looked innocent until it fell. Frank kept the lights low, not because he believed in ghosts, but because he'd learned long ago that darkness makes you honest. You either see what's there, or you admit you can't. Rex moved through the yard with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a silent patrol loop that traced the property line as if he were mapping a battlefield only he could smell. Since Ray's warning and the discovery of the tracker, the German shepherd's posture had changed, less frantic, more structured. The scars still told their ugly story. The grayed muzzle still spoke of years. But the dog carried himself now with an old professional's discipline, the way a retired soldier stands straighter when the flag goes by. He wasn't guarding because he was trapped. He was guarding because he had decided the porch was worth guarding. Inside, Frank sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold and a mind gone hot. The house smelled of wood smoke and black pepper from the simple stew Emily had left earlier. She cooked like she treated animals. Practical, steady, no unnecessary fuss. Frank's hands rested around the mug, not for warmth but for grounding. Across from him, Ray Jenkins leaned back in a chair that creaked under his weight, his thick gray beard catching the firelight in wiry strands. Ray had that cop habit of never fully relaxing. Even seated, he looked like he was waiting for a radio call. His eyes tracked the window, the door, then the window again, as if the glass might suddenly confess. "You got a plan?" Ray asked, voice low. He spoke like someone who'd learned that hope could get you killed if you said it too loud. Frank's jaw worked. "I've got options," he said. "None of them feel good," Ray snorted. "That's how you know it's real." Emily stood by the stove, rinsing a pot with slow, quiet movements. Under the warm light, she looked tired in a different way than Frank. Her exhaustion wasn't from guilt, but from carrying other beings' pain, as if it belonged in her own pockets. She wore her hair in that same low bun, a few strands loose at her temples. Her hazel eyes kept flicking to the porch, as if her instincts were stationed outside with Rex. "The tracker being removed doesn't mean it stopped talking," she said. "If it had a transmit cycle, someone may already have the last known location." Frank's stomach tightened. Ray rubbed his beard. "Meaning those polite boys from town might not be done window shopping." As if the world liked timing, a sound popped from outside. Sharp, distant, wrong. Rex froze mid-step, body going stone still. His ears pivoted forward. Frank didn't move at first, because stillness was a tool. Then a second sound followed, a crack that snapped the air and made the porch boards vibrate through the cabin floor. Not thunder, not a branch. A rifle report, clean, controlled, professional. Immediately after came a dull metallic thud. Ray was up from his chair with a speed that made his age a lie, moving toward the back window. Frank's hand went to the counter out of old habit, searching for a weapon that wasn't there because he'd sworn off that life. Emily's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. "Don't go to the window," she warned. "That's what they want." Frank held his breath and listened. No screaming, no crash, just the wind and the soft creak of snow shifting in trees. Rex's growl rolled low. Not chaotic, not panicked, a controlled warning from deep in the chest. Frank moved to the mudroom slowly, grabbed his heavy coat, and slipped out the side door into the cold. The air hit him like a slap. Rex stood near the yard's edge facing the road, his body angled in front of Frank without being told, as if his training had woken up and remembered its purpose. Frank followed Rex's gaze and saw it. The wooden signpost near the entrance of the dirt road had been struck. A fresh gouge split the timber, and a chunk of splintered wood lay in the snow like a broken tooth. The message was clear and cruelly precise, close enough to prove capability, far enough to avoid immediate charges if no one could identify a shooter. "Hello, we know where you live." Ray came out behind Frank, breath steaming through his beard. He crouched by the signpost, ran a gloved finger along the gouge. "Warning shot," he muttered. Not a drunk hunter. Too clean. Emily stepped out as well, boots crunching, her eyes scanning the tree line with the wary intelligence of someone who'd learned predators aren't always animals. "They're testing how we react," she said. Frank's mouth tasted like old adrenaline. His knee throbbed. Rex didn't bark. Rex didn't chase. He simply stood between Frank and the road, a living shield made of muscle and choice. Frank looked down at him and felt something inside his chest shift into a fierce, almost ridiculous tenderness. "Good," Frank whispered. "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was an agreement. Back inside, they didn't debate whether to call the sheriff. Ray already had his phone out, voice clipped, giving location and timeline. But Frank knew law enforcement response out here came with miles, snow, and paperwork. Even if a deputy showed up, the shooter would be gone, and the fear would remain. Ray finished the call and tossed his phone onto the table like it offended him. "They won't find squat tonight," he said. "But we'll file it. Paper trails matter." Frank rubbed his temples. Paper trails didn't matter for Rex, he said, the bitterness surprising him. Emily's gaze sharpened. "Then we make a different kind of trail," she replied. "One they can't burn." She made another call, this time not to a clinic, not to a shelter contact, but to a federal tip line number she'd been given months ago at a conference on working dog rehabilitation. The number belonged to a man she'd never met, but whose name carried weight in certain circles: Agent Marcus Reed. Emily put the phone on speaker. It rang twice before a voice answered, brisk and controlled. Reed. Marcus Reed sounded like someone who slept lightly and trusted nobody. When he arrived the next morning, the impression matched the reality. He drove an unmarked SUV that wore dust and snow like camouflage. Marcus was in his mid-40s, tall, with a lean build that suggested he worked out for function, not vanity. His face had sharp angles, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that looked permanently set against bad news. He wore a close-cropped haircut and a neatly trimmed dark beard that showed a few early grays at the chin. His eyes were a cold blue that missed nothing, the kind of eyes that had seen too many criminals smile at their own lies. There was an old scar near his right ear, thin and pale, and when Frank noticed it, Marcus's expression flickered, not embarrassed, but distant, as if the scar belonged to a different version of himself. "Car wreck," Marcus said when he caught Frank looking. "My partner didn't make it." It wasn't offered for sympathy. It was a fact that explained why Marcus's politeness had edges. Marcus stepped onto the porch and stopped short at the sight of Rex, who stood in the yard, head high, eyes locked on the newcomer. The dog didn't lunge. He didn't retreat. He watched the way a professional watches someone entering a secured perimeter. Marcus's brows rose slightly. "He's not acting like a random aggressive dog," Marcus noted. "He's posting." Emily nodded. "He's trauma," she said. "But he's also training, buried under it." Marcus's gaze shifted to Frank. "You said his name is Rex," he said. Frank held his ground. "That's what I call him." Marcus glanced at Rex again, then back. "Fair," he said. "Names are for the living." Inside the cabin, Marcus laid out the situation without drama because drama wasted time. "Captain Wade Harrington isn't just a rumor," he said, pulling a slim folder from his coat. "He's a problem with friends, private training contracts, overseas security work, and enough patriotic branding to make people stop asking questions." He looked at Emily. "Your contact at the shelter said you found a tracker." "That's significant." Emily slid the small evidence bag across the table. Marcus studied it with the focus of a man reading a threat letter. "We've been building a case," he said, "but we need a witness chain. We need someone who can prove Harrington's people are monitoring dogs after discharge." He tapped the bag gently. "This helps." Frank's voice came out rough. "So why the shot?" Marcus's eyes didn't soften. "Because Harrington's team thinks you're holding property," he replied. "And because intimidation works on most people," Ray scoffed. "Works on idiots," he said. Marcus gave Ray a glance that was almost amused, then returned to Frank. "Here's the deal," Marcus said. "Harrington is hosting a private demonstration outside Helena in 10 days. It's not advertised. It's invitation only. Contractors, money men, maybe a couple foreign buyers. It's his pride parade." Marcus leaned forward. "If we can get inside, we can document the operation and identify who's funding it. But I can't just kick the door in." "Not yet." Frank felt the old familiar pulse, the part of him that understood entries, angles, timing. He hated how awake it made him feel. "And you want me to go?" Frank said. Marcus nodded. "You're credible," he said. "Retired SWAT, rural property owner, looking for a protection dog. And you have what he wants." His eyes flicked toward Rex. "The dog." Emily's jaw tightened. "That's dangerous," she said. Marcus didn't argue. "Yes," he replied simply. Then he added, "But it's also leverage. Harrington's people already made contact in town. They fired a warning shot at your road." They're escalating. If you sit and wait, they'll keep tightening the circle until someone gets hurt. Frank stared at the steam rising from his coffee and thought of circles, how trauma draws them, how guilt closes them, how fear makes them smaller and smaller until you can barely breathe. Rex lay near the porch now, closer than he'd ever been, watching the conversation with ears flicking at every shift in tone. Marcus slid a card across the table. "I can get you a legal cover," he said. "Not fake identity nonsense. A legitimate access credential through an intermediary. You'll be evaluating services on behalf of a ranch security association. It'll hold up if questioned." Ray leaned back, folding his arms. "And if questioned by the wrong guys?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then you do what SWAT guys do," he said. "You keep your head and you buy time." Frank's throat tightened. He remembered doors, screams, that one face that still visited him at night. He had sworn never again. Then he looked at Rex, scarred, dignified, posted like a guardian at the edge of Frank's light, and realized the vow he'd made to himself had never included protecting someone else's life. That evening, after Marcus left to make calls, and Ray drove back to town to coordinate with the deputy he trusted, Frank sat alone on the porch. The sky was clear, the stars sharp as nails. Rex stood in the yard, breath puffing, eyes reflecting porch light like embers. Frank opened the front door and stepped aside, leaving it wide the way you leave a gate open for an animal that has been caged too long. Warmth spilled out onto the boards, carrying the smell of wood smoke and coffee and human loneliness. Frank didn't point. He didn't beckon. He didn't say, "Come." He simply spoke into the cold. "Your choice," he said. "Inside or out. No more cages." His voice wavered on the last word, betraying more of him than he intended. Rex stared at the open doorway as if it were a mouth that could either swallow him or bless him. The dog's body trembled, not violently, but with the effort of holding himself together. Frank felt the urge to help and crushed it. Helping by force wasn't help. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then Rex stepped forward, one paw onto the porch, another. He paused, ears flattening briefly as the warmth hit his nose. Then he crossed the threshold and entered the cabin. He didn't relax. He didn't lie down. He stood near the door as if ready to flee. But he was inside. He had chosen the warmth. He had chosen proximity. Frank's chest tightened until it hurt. He turned away to hide his face, pretending to fuss with the stove. In his mind, a bitter little joke flickered, half humor and half truth. The toughest entry he'd ever made wasn't through a barricaded door. It was letting something broken step into his life and stay. Dawn near Helena broke clean and hard, sunlight sliding across frozen fields like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath, and the cold held everything so tightly it made even footsteps sound like confessions. Frank drove the unmarked rental truck Marcus had arranged, hands steady on the wheel in the way old habits become prayer. Beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, wearing a simple dark harness. Nothing tactical enough to attract attention, nothing flimsy enough to lie. His coat still carried dull patches where scar tissue refused to grow hair evenly, and the gray on his muzzle made him look older than he was. But his eyes were sharper now, tracking the world with disciplined caution instead of helpless dread. Frank felt the dog's presence like a heartbeat he could borrow when his own threatened to misfire. He reminded himself of the cover story Marcus had drilled into him: retired SWAT, rural property, recent threats, seeking professional protection dog services. A believable need wrapped around a dangerous truth. Winter watched from the trees as if waiting to see whether this was redemption or just another way to get people killed. The facility sat outside town behind fences and pride. It was modern in a way that felt out of place against the Montana landscape. Clean metal buildings, neat gravel lanes, floodlights mounted like skeptical eyes, and a sign that promised elite canine solutions in bold letters that tried too hard to sound honorable. Vehicles lined the lot. Contractor SUVs, a few expensive trucks, and cars polished enough to imply money that didn't sweat for itself. Marcus had told Frank the event was invitation only, and the guards at the gate acted like bouncers at a club where the password was patriotism. A man checked Frank's credential and nodded without a smile. He was broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a jawline built for intimidation, his expression blank in the practiced way of private security, polite enough to avoid lawsuits, cold enough to discourage conversation. Frank rolled down his window just enough to show the badge card and keep his breath from fogging the glass too much. Rex remained still, gaze forward, the picture of an animal that had learned not to advertise fear. The guard's eyes flicked to Rex, paused, then moved on. "Park in the visitor lane," he said, waving them through. Frank drove in, pulse slow, mind awake. He'd breached worse perimeters. The difference was that this one wore a suit and called itself innovation. Emily wasn't with them inside the fence. That was part of Marcus's plan. Limit exposure, divide tasks, avoid creating a single point of failure. Emily was stationed in a van half a mile away with a portable receiver, ready to log video and audio feeds once Marcus gave the go. Ray was elsewhere too, coordinating with a deputy and keeping the cabin watched, because predators love to strike at what you left behind. Frank hated splitting up. But he'd learned long ago that a team wasn't always a group in one room. It was a set of hands moving toward the same outcome. They walked toward the demonstration yard. The ground was packed dirt iced hard, the kind that didn't forgive knees. Frank's bad knee complained on the first step, and he ignored it because he had trained himself to treat pain like background noise. Rex walked beside him with measured strides, not pulling, not lagging, his head level, ears subtly rotating. People glanced at the dog, then at Frank, then away, as if they were afraid the dog might tell a story out loud. Captain Wade Harrington took the stage, like a man auditioning for sainthood. He was tall and broad, mid-50s. His build maintained the way wealthy men maintain their reputations carefully, publicly, with discipline that served ego. His hair was dark, with silver at the temples, combed back into a style that suggested control. A close-trimmed beard outlined a strong chin, and his eyes were a pale, icy gray that looked almost friendly until you stared long enough to notice they didn't change when he smiled. His suit was crisp, expensive, and out of place in the cold, like he wanted everyone to believe he was above weather. When he spoke, his voice carried confidence and command, a practiced baritone that could sell cruelty as necessity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his hands as if offering a gift. "Today you will witness the future of canine performance, precision conditioning, peak compliance, and unmatched reliability under stress." He said stress like it was a vitamin. Frank kept his face neutral, but his stomach tightened. He'd known men like Harrington in law enforcement seminars and contractor briefings, men who spoke in polished phrases to hide rough impulses. Harrington's audience nodded along, hungry for certainty. Some wore contractor logos. Some wore uniforms. Some wore the blank expression of foreign buyers evaluating a product. Frank hated that word. Product. Rex's ears flicked toward Harrington's voice, then flattened for a second before returning to neutral. The dog didn't tremble. He didn't whine. He held himself together, and the restraint made Frank's chest ache with a fierce, protective pride. Harrington motioned to handlers who brought out a young shepherd in a bite-sleeve drill. The dog's movements were fast, controlled, impressive. The crowd murmured approval. Harrington smiled, as if he'd invented loyalty. Frank watched the dog's eyes, though, and saw something wrong. A thin, frantic edge underneath the obedience, like a man smiling with a knife pressed to his back. Rex watched too, muscles taut, and Frank felt him shift a fraction closer, an unconscious alignment, like a soldier stepping into formation. Marcus arrived from the side, blending into the crowd with the ease of someone who didn't want attention. He wore a plain winter jacket, no obvious badge, his expression calm but intent. He approached Frank without greeting, speaking low as if they were discussing weather. "We need to go behind the kennels," Marcus murmured. "Emily's monitoring a feed. She caught movement that doesn't match the schedule." Frank's jaw tightened. "What kind of movement?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "The kind you don't announce on stage." They moved along the perimeter fence toward the back buildings, keeping pace with the flow of spectators drifting between stations. Rex stayed close, head turning in small increments to scan exits, corners, shadows. Behind the main yard, the air smelled stronger of disinfectant and fear. Frank recognized the smell, like hospitals, like holding cells, like places where control was more important than comfort. They reached a row of kennel structures behind a maintenance building. A van was backed up to a side door, engine idling. Two handlers stood near it, wearing branded jackets, their posture casual in the way of men carrying out ugly instructions too many times to feel the weight. One held a clipboard. The other held a tranquilizer gun. Inside the van, Frank glimpsed a sedated German shepherd lying on a mat, chest rising shallowly. Another dog's paw stuck out from under a blanket. Frank's pulse kicked. "This isn't a retirement transfer," he said quietly. Marcus's mouth tightened. "No," he agreed. "It's evidence removal." Frank stepped forward just enough to be seen, but not enough to be surrounded. He let his old SWAT voice surface, not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakably authoritative. "Stop," he said. The handlers jerked their heads up. Frank held up the access credential, as if it granted him moral right. "Federal investigation," he added, buying time with the only currency that worked on men who feared paperwork more than conscience. "Step away from the van." The younger handler hesitated. He had a narrow face, early 30s, with sandy hair tucked under a beanie, and eyes that looked tired rather than cruel. His cheeks were reddened by cold, and a faint scar traced his upper lip, suggesting he'd been bitten at least once by a dog who didn't want what he was offering. The older handler, broader and harder, squared his shoulders. "You're not law enforcement," he snapped. "This is private property." Marcus chose that moment to step into view. He flashed his badge with the clean, quick motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Actually," Marcus said, voice calm as ice, "I am." The older handler's confidence faltered. Before the situation could settle, Harrington's voice cut through the cold behind them. "What's going on back here?" He rounded the corner with two security men at his flanks. Up close, Harrington's smile looked sharper. His eyes landed on Rex and held there for a beat too long. Something flickered across his expression, recognition, calculation, a hint of irritation, as if a file he'd tried to shred had walked back into the room. "Well," Harrington said smoothly, "if it isn't the concerned citizen with the rescue dog." The security men shifted, hands near their jackets, not openly armed, but ready to become so. Rex's ears flattened briefly, then lifted. The dog didn't back away. He didn't explode. He simply adjusted his stance, front paws planted, weight balanced, body angled slightly between Frank and Harrington. Not aggression. Coverage. Frank felt his throat tighten. "Those dogs in the van," Frank said, keeping his voice steady, "they aren't scheduled transfers. They're sedated." Harrington chuckled lightly, a sound that tried to turn accusation into misunderstanding. "Medical protocols," he said. "Some animals require special handling," he said. "Animals the way a man says, inconvenience." Marcus's gaze was steady. "We have evidence of illegal monitoring," Marcus said. "We have documentation of intimidation," he added, and Frank felt the memory of the warning shot burn in his chest. "And we have an embedded tracker removed from a dog you marked for discharge." Harrington's smile faltered by a hair. He recovered quickly, but it was enough. A crack. Truth loves cracks. Spectators began drifting toward the commotion, drawn by the unusual sight of a man with a badge near the off-limits area. A few uniformed observers, military, perhaps, appeared at the edge of the crowd, their faces tightening as they registered the van, the tranquilizer gun, the sedated dogs. Harrington's voice sharpened. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "More force now, less charm. You're disrupting a contractual demonstration." Marcus lifted his chin. "Then your contract can be reviewed in court," he replied. Harrington's jaw tightened. For the first time, the mask slipped enough to reveal the man underneath. Not a visionary, not a patriot, but a bully with expensive packaging. "That dog is unstable," Harrington said, gesturing toward Rex as if labeling him would make him disposable again. "He's a liability. You're risking lives bringing him here." Rex didn't react to the insult. He didn't have to. His calm was the answer. One of Harrington's security men shifted closer, and Harrington's hand moved toward his coat, quick and practiced. Frank saw it instantly, years of SWAT training, lighting up his nerves like a fuse. The coat opened slightly. A concealed pistol, gripped. The world narrowed. Winter held its breath. Harrington drew. Not fully, just enough to show intent, and his eyes flashed with the furious confidence of a man who believed consequences were for other people. "You don't get to take what I built!" he hissed, voice low now, no audience tone. Frank didn't charge. Marcus didn't flinch. And Rex did not become a comic book hero. He did something far more believable and far more powerful. He stepped forward, one controlled pace, shifting his body into Harrington's line, not attacking, not lunging, simply occupying space with disciplined certainty. The move forced Harrington's angle to change, forced his wrist to hesitate. That single half-second of hesitation was everything. Marcus moved in, fast and precise, pinning Harrington's gun hand against the coat seam and twisting just enough to make the weapon drop into the snow with a dull, shameful thud. The security men froze, suddenly aware of cameras and witnesses and the fact that predators hate light. A uniformed observer stepped forward, voice hard. "Captain Harrington," the man said. "Stand down." The word captain sounded less like respect and more like indictment. Harrington's face went pale with anger. He tried to speak, but Marcus was already cuffing him, reading rights with the calm of a man who had waited a long time to say them. Behind them, Emily's van feed captured everything. The sedated dogs, the tranquilizer gun, the moment the pistol fell. Documentation, the only language institutions truly respected. The younger handler, the sandy-haired one, swallowed hard and stepped away from the van, his posture collapsing slightly under sudden clarity. "I didn't know," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Frank looked at him and felt no pity, only a hard lesson. Not knowing is often a choice people make, because knowing demands action. The sedated dogs were removed carefully under supervision. A military observer ordered an immediate medical review. Spectators whispered. Phones raised, recording. Harrington's empire began to crumble, not with explosions, but with paperwork, witnesses, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Rex stayed close to Frank, calm, alert, not trembling. Frank crouched briefly, letting his fingers rest against Rex's shoulder for the first time in public. Rex accepted it, no flinch, no recoil, just a steady breath. Frank felt something in his chest loosen. Not all the guilt, not the whole past, but enough to let air in. Months later, winter returned the way it always does, uninvited, relentless, familiar. But the porch at Frank's cabin looked different now, not because the snow had changed, but because the silence had. Emily visited regularly, not as an emergency responder, but as a partner in a small program they'd built with Marcus's help. A modest network to place and rehabilitate retired working dogs, to match them with veterans and former first responders who understood the cost of service and the need for quiet patience. No flashy center, no instant miracles, just steady work, grant applications, vet checkups, and the stubborn belief that the broken didn't deserve to be thrown away. Ray stopped by sometimes too, bringing hardware and gruff advice, pretending he wasn't invested. Marcus checked in when he could, his investigation now widening like a thawing river. One evening, as snow drifted past the porch light, Frank sat on the steps with a mug of coffee that was actually hot this time. Rex lay beside his boot, close enough that Frank could feel the dog's warmth through leather. The shepherd's muzzle was still gray, his scars still visible. But his eyes held a different kind of emptiness, now the calm emptiness of a lake that has stopped thrashing against storms. Rex rested his head on Frank's boot with quiet finality, like placing a seal on a vow. Frank looked down at him, and a crooked smile tugged at his mouth. "Took you long enough," he murmured. It was a joke, but it was also a confession. Frank had been talking to himself all these years, and the dog had answered, in the only way that mattered by staying. In the end, the cold didn't change, and winter didn't suddenly become kind. The wind still came down off the Montana pines like it always had, sharp and honest. But something else changed, something you can't measure with a thermometer or prove with a report. A scarred German shepherd who had been treated like a disposable tool found a home, and a retired SWAT officer who had been living like a man already half gone found a reason to stay fully here. Some people will call that coincidence. Others will call it timing. But anyone who's lived long enough knows there are moments when the right soul meets the right soul at the exact second it has to happen, and it feels less like luck and more like God's hand quietly turning the page. Maybe that's what a miracle really is, not lightning from the sky, but a door opening when you've forgotten doors can open, a heart softening when you thought it was permanently frozen, a second chance arriving in a form you never expected. And if you're watching this while carrying your own invisible weight, stress, grief, regret, loneliness, or the kind of pain you don't talk about, remember this: God doesn't waste broken things. He rebuilds them. He uses what hurts to shape what helps. He can take the worst chapter of your life and turn it into the beginning of a purpose that doesn't just save you, but saves someone else through you. So when you step back into your everyday life after this story, back to the job, the bills, the quiet kitchen, the long nights, don't dismiss the small chances to do the right thing. Don't ignore the tug in your chest that tells you to be kinder, to be braver, to check on someone, to show up, to try again. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought in ordinary moments, and sometimes the greatest victories look like a loyal head resting on a boot and a person finally breathing without fear. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what part hit your heart the hardest. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of courage, loyalty, and the kind of grace that shows up right on time. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps. And thank you so much for watching.